Today we'll be discussing abstract expressionism, which many art historians feel is the moment when American art actually takes the stage, right? In a sense, takes to the forefront, right, of art history. Where before this, you really look at Europe, right, as guiding the artistic movements, right, guiding the artistic innovations. And now with abstract expressionism, we actually see a shift, right, to America that doesn't cease from this point out. The center of the art world will become New York City, right? So again, this is a very important moment for American art and sort of the focus of innovation within arts shifting. And we're looking about like the 1950s here, so thinking about time, we've come up right to about the 1950s, right, for this movement. And what is the world of abstract expressionism, or as I often abbreviate it, AbX? It is post a lot of things, right? It's post Depression, it's post World War II, and because of this, again, you're going to see those events kind of shaping, right, what abstract expressionists are interested in. And this is going to be a very cerebral movement. I always say it's really a lot about theory, right? How to conceive of the theoretics behind why you're making a piece of art. So I'd mentioned this idea of, art in the past being very, before modernism, art being more about, you're making a portrait of somebody, or you're doing a painting of a religious event, right? A sculpture of a religious event. You're making a political piece, right? You're doing something for a purpose, for a reason, right? Theory really didn't have anything to do with it, right? So what we see now in the arts is that theory starts to drive, right, why art is made. And this is why I would say, you may not like it, but you need to understand it. So you need to understand the theory behind why these things are made, because that's what governs it, right? Not it's pretty, that aesthetic response, right? None of that is important here. It's the reasoning behind it, right? But I would say don't count out the spiritual element that some of these artists had. Like Mark Rothko, for instance, he was very spiritual about his work, right? He wrote about his Jewish faith, right, and how it helped guide him a bit to be thinking about spirituality in a more open ended way. So, again, I don't think just because it's very cerebral means that often you don't see other elements of inspiration, right, in these works. Abstract expressionism is also very interesting because it's one of the first times you really start to see artists emerging into a world of celebrity, which for us now, of course, is just the way of life, right? Being a celebrity is just how people get attention now, how you make yourself relevant, right? We joke that you're famous for being famous, but at this point in the 1950s, it really wasn't very common to see celebrity attached to a lot of public roles, and especially not artists, right? So what we see here is sort of a media frenzy, right, that starts to get unleashed, right, regarding artists, especially, for instance, Jackson Pollock, that we'll discuss. So we'll talk about this sort of rise of celebrity here, but also the next movement we talk about, pop. It's going to be the cornerstone, right, of why pop artists are doing what they're doing. So keep this in mind. And it's very interesting to look at abstract expressionism because there's a sort of maleness to it, a very male centricness to it that does impact, right, the kind of art that's made, we believe, and how the women in the movement are seen and how they operate as well. So we'll discuss a bit about sort of the maleness here. And often, unfortunately, it's a sort of toxic masculinity. There's a lot of alcoholism, there's a lot of depression, there's a lot of sort of acting out, sort of bad behavior, we might say, especially with Pollock, for instance. So we'll get into a little bit of the gender roles here and how they impact the movement as well. Now, what is this theory? So I said this is a very theoretical movement. What is the theory? The theory that you see here is really tied to two key thinkers, two critics, right? And that is Clement Greenberg, right, and Harold Rosenberg. Notice that we're seeing Jewish names here, and it's important to understand that many Jews were fleeing Europe and coming to America. And when they came to America, they're bringing their intellectual capacity with them, right? They're bringing their brains, and so we see a lot of Jewish thinkers on the ground, kind of creating a framework for art historians, for scientists, for other people. So that's something also to think about regarding this moment. Greenberg is probably the most well known in sort of connection to abstract expressionism, and many people would say he laid the foundation of how abstract expressionists behave, right? Why they do what they do. And his idea was simple. It was that the materials should be primary to the art you're making. Now, what does this mean? I always use painting as an example. This means that a painting should only be what a painting is. So, what is a painting? A painting needs paint, you know, it needs somewhere to put the paint, some way to apply the paint, right? That's really all a painting is. A painting isn't about subject. It's not about what you present. It's about the paint, right? So Clement Greenberg's theory is that painting should only be about what painting is, and that's paint, how to apply it, and where you're applying it, right? You could be applying it on a wall, a floor, a canvas, right? You could be using your hands. You could be pouring it. You could be using a brush, right? You can be using tempera paint, acrylic paint, oil paint, whatever, right? This is all you need, though. You don't need subject. So the art should be only what the medium allows, right? And again, he'd apply this to sculpture on out. Sculpture, we'll talk about this theory more in sculpture with minimalism. That's where you see it really flourishing with sculpture. Now, Harold Rosenberg, he embraced a lot of what Greenberg said, but he also added another element, this idea that painting should be about action. And abstract expressionism is really a painting movement. So you're not going to see sculpture here. It's just not what abstract expressionists do. They paint. He's going to say, that in a sense, painting should be about action, energy, the movement of the body. You'll see this definitely with Pollock. Almost like art should embrace theater, right? Art should embrace a sense of making that's on display. That you look at a painting and you say, wow, I can really feel the action, the energy of what that person was doing when they made that painting. Now, one other thing I wanted to bring up that I think is of interest is sort of a side theory about abstract expressionism. And this was actually a theory that I learned a lot about when I was doing my doctorate because my graduate advisor, this was his area of expertise, was abstract expressionism and its link to the Cold War. Many people argue that abstract expressionism developed on its own, but then it was adopted in a sense by Americans and the American government as a way to have a contrast, right, with social realism. Now, social realism, we saw how it operated in America, and it was mainly about, documenting the Depression, using regionalism, these kind of things. But social realism, as it spread out globally, it actually, in many countries, became a tool for communists, for supporting totalitarianism and those regimes. So you're seeing here, for instance, a sculpture in Tiananmen Square in China, which is obviously a communist country. So social realism was adopted by these countries to advance, right, a socialist agenda. So where in America it wasn't about this at all. This was something that you see in China, Germany, right? These socialist countries, totalitarianist, communist influenced countries, right, in Europe and Asia. And so many people think abstract expressionism was looked at as sort of the American contrast to that, that it was very anti-communism and fascism. It was about freedom of expression, all these great American values, right? Freedom, expression, right? And that again, you can almost look at this politically. Now, what's interesting is that the American government actually funded different shows for abstract expressionism to go travel globally. And people like my doctorate advisor, they talked about how maybe this was, something that the American government was doing for propaganda. And if you ever want to read any of my doctorate advisor's work, his name's David Craven, right? He was at the University of New Mexico. Unfortunately, he's now deceased, but he worked heavily with this idea, and I sort of studied under him. And I actually did social realism as my part of my master's thesis. So again, this is something that I know a lot about as far as these social realist works and their ties to um, sort of the sense of what kind of message are you giving to your people. So when we look at the works next, hopefully you can kind of do a contrast between this type of work, like you're seeing here from Mukina, and let's say like a Jackson Pollock.